Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Seat of Pseudology podcast. I am Sentient Roomba.
I'm Cypher. Thanks for joining us today.
And I'm the anecdotalist, and today we're going to talk about nerdism, which I don't think is actually an ism, but it's perhaps something to do with how nerd culture has won and what that means for sort of social relations, okay? So I had somebody come out, to a large group, and say, "Oh, I'm such a nerd, cool." And then he opens with, "I'm really into Marvel movies." Okay, now this sounds like a very frumpy topic.
I've heard that so many times.
Um, right. So nerd culture has won like the past 10 years. It has won the culture war. I remember it used to be a protected thing, right? And I'm not trying to like go to nostalgia on this and be like, oh, it should be this way. Just
Yeah.
want to talk about sort of implications of this. So it was a protected thing, being a gamer, being into the sort of science fiction and fantasy, up until I want to say 2008.
Not
Was when it's
watching
probably
properly.
uh, well, what it means to be a nerd, really, because around 2008, I had the cool kids start to sit down next to me at school and go, "Oh, hey, anecdotalist, you you've got an Xbox 360, uh, haven't you?" And I sort of look at them like, "Yeah," and ever since, now everyone, to use video games as an example, because that's my forte. Everyone plays video games now. As a teacher, we've got the cheerleaders who play like Call of Duty. We've got the jocks that do it. I think Call of Duty is actually a pretty good example of, now video games sort of have a social hierarchy of their own or connect to that
Yeah.
social hierarchy as well.
The normies play Call of
Um,
Duty.
Right. Whereas before it was only, yeah, so now we have normies playing nerdy stuff, people being into science fiction shows, and fantasy shows. I think Marvel movies brought casual science fiction to the masses. I mean, Star Wars as well. Um, it's probably the influence of capitalism and Star Wars, particularly the past since Disney took over Star Wars. Um, I mean, there's always been a capitalistic element, even like Star Trek. I remember buying a sort of Ellen Ripley toy from Aliens. I'm like, they make toys from like really adult movies. But yeah, the nature of nerdism and where does it even stand now in these sort of like social archetypes? It's just sort of like bled out
Yeah.
into the ether.
Yeah.
Everyone's little bit nerdy now. So where do us former real nerds, where do we stand? What
Yeah.
does it actually mean
I'll
to
tell you
be a
what it
nerd?
does. I'll tell you what it does. I can't be a hipster about being liking nerdy shit anymore, right? Like, back in the good old days, I was the gamer. I was the one guy reading Lord of the Rings. I was um the person super into comic books and shit. Whenever I was probably middle school, early high school age and whatnot. And now it's like, man, everybody's into this shit. I'm not special anymore.
Yeah, that is like part of the issue is like where's the line between watering something down and just gatekeeping? Because
Yeah.
like I had the same experience when I was in high school. I was in like the RPG club. We played like
Yeah.
D&D and Magic the Gathering and stuff like that. And um it was definitely not socially accepted. But I don't know. I like to refer to it as the Big Bang phenomenon just because I fucking hate that show. And
Oh
like
yeah. Oh
I think
yeah.
everyone of at least a certain level of intelligence dislikes that show.
I wouldn't even call it
Um,
intelligence. I would call it something different.
but
Anybody with
very
like
interesting that
get critically
taste.
watches anyone that critically watches media should immediately cut that out of
right.
their watch
That
list.
that is there was an interesting. I want to talk about it, but there's an interesting video by the pop culture detective that's about 30 minutes long, and he talks about the adorable misogyny of The Big Bang Theory.
Hmm.
I would say tabletop actually probably remains quite nerdy. However, I was
This
able to
is
get
my
my normie
domain.
wife. My normie wife got into D&D for a time
Yeah.
because she recognized it. She recognized it as basically two things: as a board game, which everyone likes,
Yep.
and as a dynamic storytelling system.
Yep.
And she really liked the second thing. My wife is super normie, watches all normie shows and things like that. Fine. Um, I long learned in college, just because someone's interested in the same stuff doesn't mean you can suddenly start, if there was a woman that played, this was a female student in college who played a video game, it's like, oh my God, it's my soulmate. It's not how that works.
Not anymore.
But
Yeah.
anyway, but yeah, she was into D&D, but I would say D&D probably remains nerdy, that niche,
So
and maybe
I
trading cards.
so I've thought a lot about this too because probably my biggest hobby is role playing games. Right. I've been playing role playing games for probably 13 years or so. Even
Nerd.
tomorrow, even tomorrow, I'm going to be like running a game for a few hours for my buddies online and stuff like that. Right. Like this is something I want to do, and even like after I'm done like with my current career, thinking about getting a career at like a creative department in some sort of role playing game aspect. I think role playing games are actually a little more normie than I hate that we're using normie, but it's a little more normie than like some other games. Like I think um, card games especially, those are still definitely fringe nerdydom. As popular as they are, I can sit there in a game of Magic the Gathering and just like stare at my cards the whole time and just move them in my hand and not make any eye contact and look at you and still play the game exactly how it's meant to be played. And there's no issues, and people go to their local gaming stores and do that all the time. And they just have no social skills. They have no bearing on what's going on. They're just there to win at something, um, and it's awful. Like as much as I love those environments, I hate those environments. I can't hang out in those environments. But D
What
and
you
D,
said, it's like a,
yeah, but D and D, yeah, I'll get to you in 1 second. I'm almost done. But D and D requires social skills at a minimum, right? Like you have to talk to people, you have to cooperate with people. Now you see all the time DMs that don't have a spine, like they'll be like, "Oh, like some guy's being weird. He doesn't have social skills, and I don't know how to address it. I can't just put my foot down and be like, all right, we need to ostracize this guy or remedially reintegrate him into our group because he's like living out his weird fantasies in our game or something, right? You see that all the fucking time, because people in the nerddom, the tabletop nerd area circle, they think that they immediately get a pass into the D&D circle because they're like, oh, I play Magic the Gathering. Oh, I'm here playing the board games and stuff. Oh, I'm playing Warhammer 40K, so like I can come over here and play D&D. No. You need to be at least kind of functional, right, in a conversation, in a team building, storytelling kind of cooperative game. Um, I think, but I mean, everybody like D&D is rising in the mainstream. Everybody, like, not everybody, a lot of people are playing D&D now, and it's getting kind of popular. And I think you'll keep seeing that. The tabletop, the board game stuff, the card game stuff, probably less so. I don't think that's gonna rise too much more in popularity because there's that like wall of neckbeards, quote unquote, that like kind of defend that Magic the Gathering territory and stuff like that. As much as I hate to shit on it because I am totally in that fan base, I like Magic the Gathering too, but that's just the stereotype for the dirty, stinky gamers applies to them way more than than it applies to any sort of role playing gamers. But sorry, yeah, it went a little bit longer.
I think um, I think there's also a lot of proto D&D out with some of the board games that come out. Because I didn't realize like how like most even to the past couple of years, I thought board games were like Monopoly and Scrabble
Yeah.
and the Mousetrap. That's what I thought.
Yeah,
Board games are. You go to
Mousetrap.
board games, there's like there is like this B movie. There's this haunted house on a hill one where you build a sort of B movie as you go. I mean, there's a bunch of different scenarios that you play. Um, yeah,
I have a,
yeah,
I
yeah.
have a
There's
prop.
these board games that are making. Yeah,
It's
perfect.
very
Yeah.
complicated.
So I think board games are. You mentioned earlier about here to win and like the min-maxing
Yeah,
traits.
yeah,
Like my wife was only interested in the character building aspects of D&D as far as it served the primary purpose to her, which was a dynamic storytelling
yeah.
social experience. But then you got people that are really into um the min-maxing their character. So here's another perhaps protected nerd zone, which is LARPing, which I
Too
did.
far. Too far.
No, listen, LARPing is good. Okay,
Oh
okay. Well,
no.
here is an example. Okay, well, here's a perfect example of how the nerds you were talking about, sort of ruined LARPing for me a bit. There was a pretty good place in South London where I used to go to, and to me as a nerdy normie or a normie nerd, that's how I define myself, I guess, if we're using those two terms. Uh, the LARPing experience was kind of like how my wife interpreted D&D. It was an opportunity to basically practice improv
Yeah,
theater
yeah,
and fantasy. That was literally, and then I would have nerds come to me, and I'm relatively new, and you talk about these sort of social skills, and they're telling me about their characters, and they're going like, so
yeah.
they
That
are
happens a lot.
social, but they still can't pick up. Unlike the kind of quiet, like non-social type of nerd, they're social that can't pick up on social cues, and they're telling me all these stats and features of their advanced high-level characters that they have, and I've just started, and they're using acronyms and shortened forms. So it's like, so when my character gets stat dick tuned at level 80, then he enacts a level 6 dash Fuban spell, and just a bunch of gibberish, and they're like so like wanking off to how awesome their characters, and they're mentioning all these abilities and these stats. And I'm just like, I don't know, here I was just here because I
You're just
bought
smiling and
like
nodding. You're
this
being polite, you know, like.
I'm here because I bought this ninja costume, and I saw this LARPing had like a ninja class. I just want to pretend to be a fucking ninja from like Ninja Gaiden, like Ryu Hayabusa. I don't know what all
Yeah.
this stat shit is. I just want to do that. I just want to run around going like this with an actual legit latex sword. It was pretty good.
So
Um,
from like the psychology perspective, having your own special lexicon like that with the acronyms and the terminology and stuff, it like builds like kind of like the way you have in a cult or like in the military or in a gang or something like that. It builds that system of camaraderie, and it also makes a hierarchy to where like you have to be initiated to the group, and then you become a part of something as you learn it. There's a barrier to entry, basically.
Yeah.
So if you put in the work to cross that threshold, then you not only feel like you've accomplished something, but now you're like bought in. So it's like the psychology of persuasion, like how you get people to stay in like a group or whatever. So that's one of the things, because that's what like nerd culture used to be. Like people couldn't fit in just like normie culture or whatever. So they built their own separate like group, but it was just as toxic, if not more toxic, because all of those antisocial tendencies that people got from being ostracized in the real world, they just like doubled down on that in their own little groups, and they built these even more stringent hierarchies that are preceded by a lot of knowledge, like barrier to entry type of knowledge, because a lot of times these people had very weird niche interests too. And so
Hmm.
they could gatekeep. They could gatekeep like a motherfucker. And so I'm interested. I don't know. Obviously, I'm sure capitalism has a huge part of like marketing to the counterculture in general, but I
Yeah.
wonder why exactly like nerd culture was the thing of the fucking late 2000s or whatever, like or early 2000s. But I don't know why like nerd culture became the thing that got appropriated. I guess it's just
Hmm.
maybe random,
Yeah, let's think
but
where it started, right? Like, I guess video games I would consider kind of nerdy. At least growing up they were nerdy, and now they're not, right? Um, Comic books were nerdy, and now they're normalized. Not comic books, comic book universes. Um,
Right.
Comic books still a little. There's still some gatekeeping going on within those comic book universes. Like, oh, did you actually read the comic? This is not what this movie went off script. You still see that, right? What else was like really? I guess you could, to a certain degree, tabletop we can include there. Um, Honestly, I think you hit on a good point with the marketing aspect. Like, these movies, especially Marvel and the comic books, these movies were so fucking huge all over the world. Like, you could bring your mother that's like 60 years old, your 60-year-old mom, and she could probably get some enjoyment out of this Marvel movie. Like, because it's just like
yeah.
it follows the perfect plot for like an action comedy with a little bit of drama, and it keeps you like tuned in at all points in time, and it's just like dopamine smacking
Honestly,
in your brain.
I would maybe even separate the superhero movies from like the greater appropriation of nerd culture
Yeah.
because superhero movies were mainstream after like World War II, I want to say. And there's a lot of jingoism and a history of jingoism in comic books in general. And then because we've gone through like an economic downturn and like the wars in the Middle East and stuff like that, like us having a resurgence as a culture of like the hero narrative, that part's not super surprising. So I wouldn't even say that that part of it is necessarily strange. I think you hit on a key point though, like the Marvel movies are very formulaic in that way that like hits all of the fucking dopamine and serotonin receptors. It's like pop music
Mm-hmm.
for movies. It's just an algorithm that's like perfectly refined to like hit all of those key notes. So as much as you hate Marvel movies, maybe
I love
like
watching them, even though I'm
yeah,
like,
they're watchable. Like
yeah,
Well, that's what
they've
I
got
don't
the
like about
formula
them.
down to a science.
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel I have no agency as to whether or not when I would have critiqued, like, do I like Marvel movies? And it's like I have no agency over that. It's like yes, like it's I watch it. They are objectively good in the same that a four-chord pop song is. Well, I never actually said that about four-chord pop songs, but yeah,
Let's come to
I
terms with
think
it.
what you said about why nerd culture became mainstream, and I this might be it. You mentioned economic downturn, particularly the post 2008 world, right? Um, Before 2008, you had two tracks of people in high school, college. You had the normie crowd who were going to succeed at life. They were going to go to a good school. They were going to go to get a white collar corporate job, and they were going to go do stuff for that. And to become that is predicated on not engaging in nerd culture. So that was the normies. The normies were going to be the successful ones. They could jump through all the hoops of school, university, career, and so forth. And then you had the nerdy ones, which had much more varying levels of success. They were generally dismissed as not going to be able to succeed. But post 2008, everyone's in this huge melee, and rejecting nerd culture is no longer a guarantee that you are also going to succeed in
I
life.
wonder if that
Everyone
has
like
to do with the tech boom
I
and
was just thinking the
so
same
many
thing.
of like the rich CEOs being like the fucking nerdy
I,
guys, you
but
know?
also not that. Also just the fact that and then as a sort of secondary thing, because everything's generally pessimistic, maybe nerd culture offers this sort of escapism, like watching Friends and The Simpsons is what normies would have watched, and that's something like Friends. That was something to aspire to.
Yeah.
Watching some sort of sitcom, the normie shows, you can watch that and aspire to it. Now we all watch that and realize that, well, that's nonsense. Oh, these video games the superhero, well, this fantasy science fiction stuff. Well, I know that that's not really gonna happen. It's not telling me that's gonna happen, but I can still consume that and be like, okay, well, so that's. I think when everyone realized, well, life sucks, they started going into science fiction and fantasy, and realize, and that's the escape.
Yeah.
That's the standard, because watching the normie shows as the cultural benchmark to reach is pure nonsense now. So they just replace that benchmark with a completely make-believe benchmark in science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, it's easier to believe almost the less easy it is to believe. Like, you're not really believing it, you're just eating it up. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'm also curious, like, especially with the tech boom and the need for like the rise in computer science degrees and like the people going for, because like also whenever I think nerdy, I think like the coding guys and like the people that do um, um, basically just computer science jobs, whatever they look like. You know, there's been millions of them by now. Um, but like the traits that kind of make you good at sitting in front of a computer antisocially for hours on end, working analytically on an issue, also kind of carry over to the antisocial, min-maxing culture of like um, just like magic, like building a deck in Magic the Gathering or a D&D character um, or anything like along those lines. Because I think even like the computer science thing, I don't, even that part of nerdism. I guess they called them geeks or something. Maybe I don't know. Like way back in the day, Geek Squad or something. Um, Even that's pretty fucking normalized. Like I have a lot of very normie friends that are in computer science because it's lucrative, and um, then they get into that kind of culture too. And then I think just the growth of internet culture as well has helped with that. Help like perpetuate those memes, so to speak.
Right. The fact that nerd culture was no longer, when nerd culture in terms of what it implied was going to be the money maker, it was no longer rejected as oh well, you gotta. I mean, I think probably maybe a more simple analogy for this is the Ready Player One sort of that scenario where everyone's living in like a giant slum and people are going into VR worlds. I mean, that's the sort of one aspect to it. Um, but yeah, when people are looking at the nerds and the nerds are making all the money, it's like, oh, and then along with it came the acceptance of everything that nerds do. I remember that nerd versus geek dichotomy.
Yeah,
It was a
Yeah.
few of us were really anal about it in the
yeah,
mid to late 2000s. Like, oh,
yeah,
I'm a geek, not a nerd,
yeah,
something, because nerd was like really special, like low social skills, low
yeah. We were
functioning,
proud of it.
right? And then yeah, we're proud to be a geek, right? And then we rejected being a nerd,
Yep.
right? And then there was dork, which I think was not really. I think that was more of an American thing, at least
Yeah.
for me. But yeah, we had geeks and nerds. Like, I'm a geek, not a nerd.
Yeah.
But the nerds like never said that. The nerds were never into like, oh, I'm a nerd, not a geek kind of thing. I don't know.
It's
But
like
yeah,
saying
then,
that D&D is fine, but LARPing is gross. It's a cipher. Keep those people over there.
You
I
do
don't
keep those
associate
people over
with
there. I'm trying to play a fun game with well-adjusted people. Nobody well-adjusted is wearing armor on a 90-degree fucking day, shouting "Fireball!" Got the fucking across the field.
excuse you for a second. We didn't shout fireball, all right? There were actual incantations we had to read, and it was good. We didn't say just fireball. We had to read, say an incantation. Um,
That makes it more
and you had to
acceptable,
memorize the
actually.
incantation.
That makes it more
I
acceptable
think
for me.
I think another big reason for the shift was because of like internet culture, like you said, but the medium of the internet. So if you think about the days when like Friends was the popular show, the network had to decide what shows to put on their lineup that would be widely acceptable by the majority of people in the entire United States. Now, like you can be a little more niche with it because you have like streaming services and internet chat rooms and like groups for all these different things. So you can find people all over the world that are into the same niche interest you're in, and the people who are producing the media don't have to They still do to an extent, but not to the
Yeah,
extent they used to with network TV. They don't have to make something as bland and widely
yeah.
applicable as they used to.
They don't have to pander to the common denominator anymore, as as much. They still have to do so to get funded, I'm sure.
Now the
Um,
movies just have to pander to China, but that's a whole different thing.
well, I mean, with half of our world's population in two different countries, that's kind of pandering to the common denominator still.
Yeah, we could have a whole episode talking about like Chinese influence in movies and stuff and like the way that Hollywood's going with like film production and stuff in general. Because I think the
Mm.
film industry is dying. That's not like a hot take. That's pretty widely accepted. Like, and the
Games
amount
too,
of influence that China has on just like random shit in films is pretty wild, but that's a
and
different
games and
different
games.
subject.
They own a
And
lot
games,
of
yeah.
like large game companies that and some games are pretty drastically centered or censored or like certain things have been changed to appeal to a Chinese audience instead of a Western one, which is really
Yeah, I
interesting.
should Yeah, I should rephrase. The film industry is not dying. The film industry in the United States, specifically for like that audience, is dying because the mass market appeal is still there. And like the majority of money made by Hollywood blockbusters now is overseas, not in the States. So rephrase that a little
I
bit.
It's
wonder.
also, I mean, that goes back to how video games have sort of like outpaced the revenue of movies. Now like video games are now overtake that, and I mean we're talking about capitalism ruining video games too, and movies and all this sort of dying. I always feel like indie games are no longer indie.
Mm.
Like
Depends on how you want to define it.
everyone, I don't know. Like it's the video gaming is so, with the micro. Okay, so there's been plenty of hot takes. We don't even talk about this, but with the microtransactions, so capitalism and gaming, like Jimmy Sterling talks about that, or Jim Sterling. I know he changed a bit recently. I haven't seen him in a bit, so he always talks about that kind of stuff. But even like indie gaming is now, I don't know, gaming is really big because I play like boring stuff, like there's still stuff like Truck Simulator and I like to
Euro
play
Truck
or Farming
Simulator is a masterpiece. All right, no
Right.
matter what anybody else says, that's a masterpiece of a game.
It still feel I still feel there's still games like that out there. That there's this sort of vertical slice off the gaming industry, which remains if we have, the regular pace off the gaming industry through the 90s and 2000s, and then we have this wacky, like sort of normie card Madden at 2K. You have that offshoot with infested by microtransactions, card Assassin's Creed. There's that,
FIFA.
but the game industry still, I feel like, still exists within its sort of natural progression that it was going to take if before it got infected by normie. There's still games there that cater in within that sort of dimension. It's still I still feel this like discomfort with it though. I don't know. It's just, and this is probably just nostalgia. Maybe remember you can talk about the psychology of nostalgia because it generally feels like, and like now as I'm getting older, I saw like the Gen X memes and the Boomer memes on Facebook about how it was back, back in the day. It was better, but now I'm beginning to see no, gaming in the early late 2000s, 2007, for example, was legitimately good. I feel like it was good, but is that the psychology of nostalgia speaking?
I mean, well, the nostalgia certainly could put rose-colored glasses, so to speak, on your eyes. But like, if games were good at the time, whenever you were there to enjoy them, they were good at the time. Are they? Do they hold a candle to some of like modern games? Some of them don't. Some of them are timeless, but some of them don't. Um, and that's okay. But that doesn't make them bad or anything. It doesn't mean nostalgia's like there's just legitimately good games. Why is Mario fucking still successful today? Why is it still a successful franchise and people still play Mario 1, 2, and well, especially 3? Like, it's just a good game. It's a solid platformer, right? Um, obviously, then you have like people that are just obsessed with certain franchises and stuff. Like I think I talked to somebody the other day about um, cartoon shows and nostalgia, and how we were talking about how Ed and Eddie as kids was so fucking good. It was like the best Cartoon Network show. I'm a little bit younger than y'all, so ignore this. But it was like the best Cartoon Network show ever. And then as adults, we go back and watch it, and it was awful. It's awful. It's like it's just not a good show. Period. Dot. But there's other
Yeah.
good shows like Courage the Cowardly Dog that was great as a kid. I can go back and watch that as an adult, and that's still a pretty good show. Like it's still the formula works, and it's not too cheesy and crappy like Ed and Eddie or something is. I think some media is just timeless. But anyway, I interrupted what she was going to say.
Yeah. So how do nerds? How do we? It was also age to play in as well. So I can't define myself, and I don't. I can't, and I also don't. I don't really care to define. I prefer to I define myself now as a dad, but how do, let's say, the normie nerds, or let's say not normie nerds, the geeks, right? I'm a geek, not a nerd, of the late 2000s. How do we now define ourselves when everyone says, "Oh, I'm a nerd now," and then it's just like, "Oh, you like to play this game? No, you just like watch Marvel movies? Okay, like how do we define ourselves? Do we need to define ourselves? Is there some sort of problem with defining ourselves? Should we even worry about it?"
You just
Yes.
have to gatekeep harder and
Yeah.
get weirder and weirder and find more and more niche shit.
It's exactly what I was about to say. Like you still have all these people that still exist in different. They're just in more niche circles now, right? Like I can go on one of my forums, one of my image boards, and there's like very niche topics that people still discuss heavily, and gatekeep heavily. Um, that's pretty much that's the answer, right? Like there's always going to be gatekeeping, and there's always going to be like a sense of superiority by
There's a
through
there's a
Or
gatekeeping.
dirty there's a dirty word to like gatekeeping, but this
I don't
goes
think there's
back to
anything
like
wrong with it inherently. I don't think there's
no,
anything wrong with.
gatekeeping, like I don't, and this is getting up. This might get slightly off topic, but I don't like let people like what they want, and I'm like, no, there is stuff that is shit, and you can acknowledge, as long as you acknowledge it's shit. But no, I will not let people like what they want, because you have a cultural decay if you just let people like whatever.
Okay, so this is where I would say you're wrong, respectfully. So, or rather, I think I should give you a chance to clarify, because here's how I see this, and I think that we should debate on this if this is not how you see it, because you're wrong. Anyway, so you have people should like what they like, unless it's shit. Like that's what you said. But I think even if it's shit, they should still be able to like. They should still be able to like it. That's fine. Um, whatever, like for whatever reason, if it's escapism, if it's nostalgia, if it's maybe it's just cheesy and it makes them feel good. Like that's all those things are fine. But then you mentioned moral decay, societal decay, or whatever. That I kind of agree with. I don't think you should just be able to like anything that you like, or I don't think you should just be able to consume anything that you want to. I think some things are dangerous, quote unquote, to consume, and I would say I would agree with you completely on that one. Actually, hold on, you probably shouldn't be consuming that, because um, here's where gatekeeping should exist, because this is not a healthy
Right.
meme for your
So
brain to
my
latch
wife
onto.
watches. My wife watches a variety of normie shows. My wife, my wife, comma the normie sounds like a title or something.
Yeah.
But no, she watches a variety of stuff, and I come down and I talk. She was like, "Why are you watching this? This is dumb. You're dumb." And she's like, "Yes, I know it's dumb. I'm just watching it because it's basic." And it's the same reason I might play a game which is basic, like a first-person shooter. Like I know it. Now, I'm going to do something very forbidden in any sort of philosophical or political discussion. I'm going to mention 1984. Okay, so because people fucking when they mention 1984, they talk about like the radio you can't turn off. Like, oh my god, like fuck that, not that fucking radio. Look, there was a scene in 1984 which I don't think people paid attention to. Which was the big thing about 1984 is that the main character, Winston Smith, was not. He was lower middle class. He was part of the middle class. He was part of the outer party. I know they mentioned that the conditions that he lives in is like very sort of abject. But the point was is that he was part of the politically conscientious middle class, the outer party or something like that. And what people don't know about 19, what might people miss over 1984 is that there is still a regular social class, like the proletariat, which Winston Smith is not part of. And life for them is actually pretty good. I don't think people realize this in 1984. There's a scene where Winston Smith looks out his window and there's some woman. She's hanging up her laundry, and she is humming out a pop song that was designed by the government or something, by a machine being run like, or like some government machine designed this pop song, which is exactly what how police pop music functions now, how cinema functions now. So it was what written in the late 40s, right? So that was a great aspect of 1984, but that was like one line, like a couple lines in the whole novel, and people don't talk about, and that's a great thing to talk from 1984 was about that. Now that's why I can't accept just let people like what they like. As long as there's some self-awareness, like, yeah, I'm just watching this trashy stuff, whatever. But it's like video games, like, oh, I like Call of Duty, and it's like, it's good. I just let me like Call of Duty. It's like, no, it fucking propagates all this shit about like the American military complex, American imperialism. It's ruined gaming with microtransactions and like there is stuff out there which no, you're not allowed to like. I'm sorry. It's just
Yeah. All right.
not
Yeah. Yeah, I
things
agree.
like that. So, but people again on when you have these conversations on social media, it's like
Yeah. Why are you
two
gatekeeping
extremes.
my enjoyments? I'm just trying to kick back, drink a ice cold Bush Light, and play some fucking Call of Duty after my hard day of working at my factory job, processing chicken or
Yeah.
something, right?
Yeah,
Like,
because I mean, I've got a friend, local friend. He's a plumber, very intelligent, very sort of well-written anarchist, extremely critical of the American system. He's really cool. He still plays like COD Warzone, and that's like okay. Obviously, he has some self-awareness there, but there's very much like in 1984, there is a sort of glut of mass media produced with I won't say malicious intent, but it definitely is there in a sort of very, like bread and circuses, very sort of straightforward dystopian
yeah.
sort of way that is marketed, and then also just yeah, that's why I think stuff like gatekeeping is important, and sort of having standards is important. Um,
What about from a
And
medic level, Roomba?
I was gonna go in a completely different direction because yeah, there's some amount of like things that become popular are popular of their own accord because of like the drive of memetics or whatever.
Yeah.
But on the bread and circus aspect, I'm wondering how bad it actually is to have bread and circus in a representative democracy because
What is that?
I'm not a fan of representative democracy in general. And like, if you have the plutocracy controlling the people through like bread and circus, I would feel like that would actually be preferable to like all of those individual actors, like trying but failing to, well, that's hard because if you have an aggregate of uninformed voters and they're just like making decisions across the board, um, they actually average out to be more often than not the correct choice. Like, so if you have a bunch of people guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, and this is kind of more talking about economic policy, but like if you have a bunch of people guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, some people are going to guess wildly too low, some wildly too high. If you take the average of all the guesses, it's generally pretty fucking spot on because one individual person will be wrong, but when you aggregate all of the data, they're more often than not right. So if you have a democracy where people are like a tabula rasa, like a blank slate, then you can still generally come out with economic policy and even to some extent social policy. You can come out with like generally good outcomes from voting. Now, that doesn't take into account representative democracy in a two-party system where people aren't actually voting on like the issues themselves, but that's a whole separate thing. But like when you have those voters influenced, then they're not just voting their random conscience.
They're not
There's like the
tabula rasa
propaganda
anymore.
machine or whatever. So at that point, you're kind of worse off being any sort of hybrid. It's like at that point, you have to go one extreme or the other to get any kind of benefit from the situation. Because if you have this weird blend, then you're just like getting the worst of both worlds. So I'd say bread and circus isn't inherently bad, depending on who is in charge of the system. And I think that a blind plutocracy that's based on the best interests of like the bottom line and I don't want to say capitalism, but like just economic interest in general without regard to any, like, there's no captain driving the ship, right? There's no one looking forward to the best interest. There's just all these individual companies that are trying to like short and make the most money in the least amount of time. But capitalism does not have the ability to have foresight into the future for like what's better for people. It's very much like now focus short term, like make money. So, um, I would say that more bread and circus could be good or less, but
No, I
not the
th-
bread and circus itself, just the level that we're at in the middle.
now I
It's
think I
bad.
know what you mean by bread and circus, but explain that just like in terms of because we were just talking about the video games and how like the microtransactions and stuff are all fucked up and you're
Circus is
getting
like
propaganda
Marvel movies. Is literally just stuff to keep the masses docile,
fed and
reinforcing.
entertained.
So yeah, so a lot of, for
Bread and
example,
circus.
and this is the more cynical interpretation of like representation, like Netflix doing their
Yeah,
representation matters thing is to, we talked about this a while ago, like don't worry, movies are casting black people, racism doesn't exist.
yeah,
That's a very cynical take on bread and circuses, but that's why I'm also very, I, people get really caught up in representation in movies and video games, and that's a way it's sort of like a sort of nerve staple to keep people like, it's sort of like a false. I wish I had a better vocab, but it's sort of just a way to keep people in line and be like, it's okay, we're casting you in video games now.
I would say
So
it's even more
racism.
insidious than that, like not just placating them by like appealing to their wishes, but placating them by manufacturing false or not even false, but manufacturing conflicts. So if you have a situation where there's not good casting, that's almost better bread and circus than when you do placate them by giving them like diverse casting, because then they're focused on these like social justice issues of like fighting this corporation and they're like fighting each other all the time and not actually able to change anything.
No, I've talked about this in coincidentally the, well, wait, no, I haven't mentioned it in our episodes. I mentioned it before these episodes. But basically, when people hyper focus on casting in video games and movies as a form of activism,
Yep.
which is absolutely disastrous for everything. It's just like, oh my gosh, like, and yeah, I'm wondering if there maybe is some sort of corporation going.
see, I see it from
We
two
can get.
angles. I see it from two angles. Yeah, I think y'all's cynical take is extremely accurate. To be honest, I think I think a little cynically about it, but at the same time, representation is important. Like, there's not a lot of. I mean, I'm sure you could debate it because then I could go deeper and say, well, identity is shit anyway and probably not good for you. But representation for your identity is important, right?
Oh yeah,
At least at a cultural level, or like just at a
I do enjoy. I mean, like me, like I have a daughter and a son now. Well, my son's a bit light skinned at the moment, but like, I mean, he's still young. But my daughter is like just very ambiguously brown, And now they're casting a lot of sort of ambiguously brown characters and things, and that's cool. And like
Yeah.
with cartoons, kids shows that now just blanketly like they don't care about like the new Witcher show, Dragon Prince.
Yeah.
It's Western fantasy, and they don't give a shit about there has to be one. No, they just cast a black person, Asian person, like, and that's great.
Yeah.
So my kids get it because I hated.
Ooh.
That's why I hated. So going back to nerdism, I hated fantasy growing up because it was just like it was Western European fantasy, and I couldn't fit into that. And then I had to play some fucking Arab analog, even though I'm not Arab. Or actually, when in the LARPing, I played as the East Asia analog. So I would, I can't say it, but I would laugh with like an offensive, like Chinese accent. But now it's great.
Living life.
Now the corporations like or the people making shit, they just cast whoever the fuck, which is great, which is fine. We don't
Yeah.
have to care about that. Like it's I would always prefer science fiction every time because I don't have to justify why I'm playing a brown
Hmm.
character. I can make a whole fucking Star Wars. I made up, and that was a great thing about the Legends series of Star Wars is that you can make up your own fucking planet. So that's what I did. I just made it's a fucking planet of brown people. Like you go to that fucking planet, it's just brown people everywhere. That's where my character's from. It's a brown people planet. That's great. So yeah. So again, it is two things. So it's
That's the
great
best kind of manufactured like dramas to have though, is things that are legitimate, like
Yeah.
legitimate
Yeah.
grievances. That's why they roll out fucking abortion every election season, because if abortion had a clear good side versus bad side, like it wouldn't keep resurfacing. Like there's a legitimate issue there that people have with like definitions and worldview that's irreconcilable. So yeah, representation is very important and it does make a huge difference, which is what makes it such a perfect tool. And this is what the fucking lefties and the communists would talk about with like class reductionism. Like anyone who tries to say that you're being divided, like stop fighting each other, we need to fight the real enemy, then they're like, you're a fucking class reductionist. You don't care about representation. You don't care about people of color. That's why it's a good wedge issue. That's why it keeps coming up, because there are legitimate good points on both sides.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it effective.
So, more aborted babies in movies.
Mm. Never mind. I'm not going to say that.
Representation is important.
Yeah,
And so
it's representation is important.
it kind of
I mean,
brings
also
me.
representation can exist. It's just that, like, if we get rid of capitalism, and whatever, all the other kind of psychological, bad mojo, we're still going to be making shows. We're still going to be making video games.
Yeah.
And we're still going to want to make that with representation.
Yeah.
Representation anyway. So yeah, so that matters. It's just a way that it's been weaponized, I
Yeah.
guess.
Everything is. Just, even to sell more copies. It's been weaponized to sell more copies. Now, more Asian people are going to buy this movie that features Asian people, and more Mexican people are going to watch this movie that features Mexico heavily. Right? It's. I think it's kind of a no-brainer in both directions. We're too diverse of a culture to not have diverse casts in movies, but at the same time, it just sells too fucking well for us to feel good about it. Do you think the same people that have issues with diverse casting have this like also have issues with affirmative action? You think those are the same people? It's called affirmative action, right? The where people are like,
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap with those issues for sure. That's a huge part of it. The same people, like, there it's hard to paint that with a broad brush because there's people from all different ideological perspectives that would be against like diverse casting for multiple reasons. But yeah, the same people who would be against affirmative action would also be.
That might also be, if we talk about nerd culture, this sort of intersection and that type of intersection, but that intersection between science fiction and fantasy also being a vehicle for promoting diversity as well might also been one thing that normalized nerd culture.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's pretty closely aligned with leftism in general, and like Cthulhu swims left or whatever, and like we've gone towards that kind of utopian sci-fi thing. Although we did go through a phase of dystopian with like the resurgence of zombie films and apocalyptic films in general, like again after 2008 and stuff like that. But yeah,
So
I
curious
think
what utopian science fiction, because I'm actually looking for utopian science fiction. I watched, the new Star Trek.
Brave
Not
New
yeah.
Star
World,
Trek.
such
Yeah,
good. My
I would
favorite
say
book
Brave New World is
once upon a time.
utopian.
I
Well,
love that book
actually, yeah,
so much.
that's actually that's another thing we're talking about. So I'm big into Star Trek and Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. So Star Trek Picard, if you watched it, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But basically, Star Trek Picard is about how Patrick Stewart, not Jean-Luc Picard, but how Patrick Stewart got mad about Brexit and took it out on Star Trek. God bless Patrick Stewart, but he's probably like a more for old guards, so it's like social democrat type of thing. I
Boomer.
was lamenting with this new Star Trek, except the animated Star Trek, the new animated show from Star Trek Lower Decks is great. Um, but the other two, they're very dystopian, not dystopian, they're very pessimistic. Like Star Trek The Discovery season one is extremely violent, very mean-spirited in certain places. I'm like, I'm not watching Star Trek for this. Um, so you say that science fiction is moving away from dystopian, but there's definitely a sort of gritty bent to a lot of it. And I'm just like, I don't,
Well,
and
I
it's
don't.
like our failure to conceptualize a utopian sci-fi setting. Like, we don't have, like, people will laugh at the idea of Star Trek, either like the original series or the next generation. Like why like they should just fucking make me a solar punk or something optimistic, or
I
yeah,
think.
even in video games, like a space colonization video game, you're working for some sort of corporation.
Yeah, like
Um,
I I
outer
think
worlds.
actually.
yeah,
I think those are not. I think those are mutually exclusive. Maybe. So I think what she was talking about us as a society moving towards more of a like culturally moving towards more of a utopian acceptance kind of deal. I think you're going to actually see a rise in the grittier, edgier kind of media, like you have at least with anime over the last several years, right? You're probably decade. You've seen a rise in edgier, grittier, like more adult, quote unquote, anime. Um, and things of that nature or any sort of media of that nature because like I think watching these shows kind of helps us express ourselves in a way we can't culturally
It's
because like
catharsis.
yeah
Yeah, you get like a sense of catharsis from it. The same
yeah
reason people like being scared or watching horror movies in general or seeing bad things happen in
yeah
movies.
it's like oh yeah this guy is a like speaking of okay we can talk about that later but yeah because like yeah these guys people want to watch they like the edgy they like the gritty shit but in real life like in IRL in this social sphere we are moving towards I think more nice shit,
And I would say, as much as we don't particularly like them, like that's what the Marvel movies are. It's like the utopian type of sci-fi where like the good
The
guys win
heroes
in the
always
end and
win, and
it's like good versus evil. And even the moral quandaries that they pose, where they do try to show some gray areas, it's still they conflate things with other things and then make the bad person obviously the bad guy, even when they had a somewhat good point, which I feel like is even worse. That's even
yeah,
worse propaganda
yeah,
than painting the bad guy with a broad black brush. Like then they're just saying, well, yeah, they have some good points, but look, they're still bad. Like so maybe these good points are bad. Like,
yeah,
yeah.
very curious as to the status of. So I'm playing Batman Arkham Knight,
yeah.
which is great. It's a great game, and I'm enjoying playing Batman, and I'm enjoying, that whole aesthetic. But it's from 2015, and Batman has aged badly, the
Yeah.
past five, and I'm just curious as to what the state of Batman. Like, I'm not going back to nerdism of like actual comic books. How do they even write Batman? Because I know, like in Injustice 2, They have and like the recent Batman films, they don't even talk about Batman and
Nobody
like the
gives a
crime
fuck about
fights.
Batman anymore. It's all about the Joker. Just like
Right.
Batman's
Yeah,
dead.
Oh,
it's
yeah, you're
gross,
right.
man.
But the
It's
recent
all
framing of
about the
Batman
anti-hero
And the
now.
art and the Harley
in
Quinn,
Ugh.
the
oh yeah,
gigantic
yeah, yeah,
resurgence of
yeah,
Harley
you're
Quinn
right.
as an
Well, I mean,
anti-hero now.
I
And you,
guess you're right. But there's the answer. That's the response to Batman. They just don't mention Batman. But what they've done with Batman recently, so the most recent video game Batman is probably Injustice 2, but in the movies, Justice League Batman versus Superman, they don't even address Batman and in his normal role. They're doing like the high level Batman stuff, like
yeah,
Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, like a Marvel thing. They're not doing Batman in Gotham City. I don't think they're ever going to revisit Batman
not for a long
in
time.
Gotham City. Now it's about Batman and Superman and the Justice League in Injustice 2 or in the recent movies by Zack Snyder.
Yeah,
They're not even going to touch that. It's just Batman is basically an anti-hero Iron Man now.
right.
They're not going to do.
Mm.
And he's too dark and gritty almost, and his society that he paints is a little bit too grim, right? Like we're gonna see that resurge whenever like whenever we want to see grim because we're grim, we're gonna want to see more Batman. But right now, like Spider-Man's making a huge resurgence. Um,
I haven't actually watched any of the Spider-Man films. Like,
they're
is he
actually
fighting
pretty good.
crime?
They're actually pretty good. Spider-Man was my favorite hero growing up as a kid, like as a young kid,
I
right?
can see that.
Um, I mean, he's young, he's kind of smart, he's very funny. I'm not
Yep.
saying that I'm Spider-Man. I'm Peter Parker. I can play a mean one though. But
Better than what's his name from the fucking
it's
2000 Spider-Man.
it's a more idealistic kind of superhero story. Like the Spider-Man, like he gets the girl, he beats the bad guy, he swings around having a good time. The bad guys are very plainly black and white bad guys. Um, Man, Spider-Man's just the shit. I love Spider-Man. Fuck.
All
He's
Yeah,
so
right,
good.
compared
so
to
I'll
where I'm
drop my
playing.
take. My take is that DC is better than Marvel in general. But
Agreed.
on that note, like whatever, if we want to like bring it back to the overall point or give some like last thoughts on the overall of like nerdism stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's inconclusive. I guess we have to increase. Well, what Cypher said, there is still. So, for example, I play Final Fantasy 14, which I think is firmly still. No, I mean, Final Fantasy was always like you'd always know one or two hot girls that play Final Fantasy. Sorry, I shouldn't like. I know, hot girl is now like not an acceptable way to like judge it, like particularly high school,
Cancelled.
right? Right, no, but I mean, like, because you don't put hot girls and video games. Let's say cheerleader. All right, cheerleader.
Yeah.
Way easier. But Final Fantasy was always a reliable one. But Final Fantasy and The Sims. That was my mistake as in secondary school and university. Oh, a girl plays either The Sims. Let me tell her about fucking Euro Truck Simulator or something, or Final Fantasy. Yeah, I play Final Fantasy 14, and I'm in discords where we talk about the lore and all the role playing stuff. It's still there. The nerdism. Yeah, I think nerdism is still there. It still has its people off. I've noticed that some of us, yeah, there are still some of us, the geeks, not nerds. We've grown up and we still participate in these. I still find that in the Discord, like, I participate in those very nerdy conversations, but some people get really sort of like very too nerdy with it, and it's just you need some grounding in like real life to interpret that and to contextualize this conversation, what you're talking about, sort of thing. That is still there. It's just nerd culture still won. Like it's almost like nerd culture won, but at what cost? That's what I mean. That's what it feels like.
Yeah. It remains to be seen. We could still probably talk about this for a long time, but right now we should call it to be continued. Right?
So just to summarize, I think that our main point is we need more gatekeeping.
Yes.
Bread and circus is good.
Yes.
We need to control the minds of the people
Yes.
and get fucking weirder with nerd shit.
Yeah, weird is
Yes.
good. Not like socially, like not social inept. Weird.
Yeah.
Like, just like
We also
weird.
need to like stop all the degenerates too.
Can you wait until after
Oh.
I die? I need to. I'm enjoying my degenerate status.
All
Which
right.
maybe we should talk about that because I don't know what that
I
how
would
that's gonna
love
happen.
to have
We
a
should
an
do an entire
episode
episode on degeneracy. Yes.
Is
not
this
only degeneracy but
a
psychoanalyzing each
fascism
other.
podcast?
Yes. All right. That's one of the upcoming episodes.
I'm gonna stop recording real
Tune
quick.
in. Wait. Tune in one of the future episodes for degeneracy and psychoanalysis. All right.
Yeah, where we psychoanalyze Roomba because she's the most degenerate person here.